And thanks all for coming, and thanks Stephen for making the time from Norway across the other side of the world in an Arctic storm. So yeah, tonight I know cyclones here in Queensland and blizzards, but yeah, Stephen is a sort of fount of knowledge on all things edimentals, so ornamental edibles, plants. He has sort of had a prolific career in this field, has a massive garden over in Norway. He's made salads with over 100 different edimentals, as they're called. And yeah, very much in the theme of this talk, just to really, broaden everyone's horizons around what is an edimental, how you can incorporate it, how you can forage it, and broader reflections too, I suppose, around, the future of food and rediscovering certain varieties as well, and, their edibility. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Stephen, and we've got an interactive display here of edimentals that we will make into a salad for you all to enjoy at the end. So over to Stephen.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you very well, Stephen. Thank you.
Okay, well, first thing, let's share my screen. Okay, you need to give me permission to share my screen, I think.
Well, I can see your screen already. I don't know. There's nothing coming up to say permission needed.
It says host disabled, participant screen sharing. Okay.
You're coming through loud and clear, but I can't see anything that says
you can't see any PowerPoint or anything, no?
I can see your face. I can hear you. I'm getting the full view.
Yeah, you're just getting the, yeah.
That should work now. Yeah.
Okay, I'll try again.
Yeah, you're on full screen to me.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't know how the others are going. I don't know how Brian and Joan are going.
Yeah, your screen's coming through.
Yeah, now I can see. Pinch out for a bigger picture, and I can see your PowerPoint.
Julie, yeah.
How's that?
Yeah.
Wow. Does that look good?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, anyway, welcome everybody to my living room here in Malvik in Norway, on a really blustery day up here at 63.4 degrees north. We have a major storm going on, so if everything goes black suddenly, you know what's happened. Yeah, actually already there are quite a few thousand people without electricity this morning, so quite a lot of damage. But cross fingers, and we'll manage to negotiate this without any problem. Is everything looking good so far?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. Anyway, as Sam already mentioned, edimentals is a word actually which I invented, if you can invent a word. It's a portmanteau word, edible ornamentals, short form for that, to describe those wonderful plants that are not only tasty but also beautiful to look at. As a word I invented in 2008, so 17 years ago now. And I've been plugging on using that word. I have my website, edimentals.com, and I have a Edimentals Facebook group with, I think, about 5,000 members now. And amazingly, just finally, the word edimentals seems to have matured, and it's being adopted around the world. And it all started, I think, at the Chelsea Flower Show in London 2 years ago, when one of the designers had picked up on this word and one of the gardens on display there was an edimental garden. 2 years on, I was invited earlier this winter to write a feature article for the Garden, the big magazine of the Royal Horticultural Society in the UK. And that article is going to be published on Edimentals, a 6-page feature coming in the April edition of the magazine. So everything's looking up for this word. Then I should mention that my book, Around the World in 80 Plants, there's another title of exactly the same title by Jonathan Drury, which came out in 2022. Mine is from 2014, so don't buy the wrong book. And in the book from 2014, I introduced the word edimentals for the first time, I think, in the literature. And basically, the book, when the book came out, I started a journey around the world, literally. I have taught in about given lectures in about 13 different countries around the world, also in many European countries. I was in Japan, I was in New Zealand, sadly not in Australia, it didn't quite work out. I was in the States and Canada 3 or 4 times. So I literally traveled around the world, and one of the specialities I started building up was this thing of walking and talking in botanical gardens and large collections of plants around the world. So I'd basically take a group around a garden and show them the edible plants amongst the ornamental collections. And I found that a lot of fun. I'd been doing it for many years on my own. And in order to learn about these plants, I visited many botanical gardens around the world. Anyway, so I thought, therefore, when I was approached by Sam to do this talk for you about edimentals, it would be fun to actually do a virtual edimentals walk around Burnley Gardens, where you're located. I was able, Sam sent me a complete plant list for the garden, which is available on the internet. I also use the Royal Botanical Garden in Melbourne's plant list, which is also available, and basically based the talk around plants that you guys can grow in Melbourne. Just as a little explanation, I have 3 names. Kvan is a Norwegian word meaning angelica, specifically Angelica archangelica, very well-known herb around the world. Kvan is also our national seed-saving organization, the letters standing for knowledge and protection of useful plants in Norway. So we conserve old varieties of in particular vegetables, and we also work towards a greater diversity of food plants in the face of climate change and food security issues here in Norway. And then my website, edimentals.com. I'm also, since I took early retirement in 2017, I took on 2 more gardens. So I have 3 at the moment, and I'm a visiting researcher at the Ringve Botanical Garden, which is the big botanical garden in the city of Trondheim, near to where I'm living. And there I've developed this onion garden, which I'll show you pictures of a bit later. Okay, and you might notice that I have 3 letters after my name, ESM. I come from the UK, moved to Norway 42 years ago. And of course, coming from the UK, we like to have letters after our names to show how important we are. Well, mine, ESM, stand for Extreme Salad Man. And that has to do with the fact that 22 years ago now, I made what still is the world record in salad diversity, which Guinness weren't interested in because they didn't have a category for this. So I never got into the Guinness record book. But this salad had actually 537 species of plant, which were all grown in my subarctic garden up here in Norway. And all these other salads you see here were all over 100 different species, and many of them, they look beautiful as well. In fact, in recent years, I've been collaborating a lot with artists, so there's certainly an artistic part to this salad making. And have my own diet, 80 a day, keeps the doctor away. I very rarely get to that many, I must admit, but usually I'm eating 20 different vegetables. When I go out into my garden, I effectively forage my garden. I never know what I'm going to bring in, but usually it's at least 20 for dinner and often for lunch as well. Okay. And this was a salad which I started with. This was a salad made also in 2014, the year the book came out, but was made for the local newspaper in Trondheim, Adresse. And to my great, they were writing a feature article about the new urban agriculture trend, which was completely new at that time. And to my great surprise, they actually published a list in botanical Latin of all the ingredients in this salad. I've never seen in a newspaper before. That's all the ingredients. Similar to the spread I think you have at the front of the room where you're located at the moment, which I'll come back to later at the end of the talk. I've also made a salad. My most edible flowers in a salad is 115. I've made a pesto with 230 different alliums, a ferment with 412 different plants. I made a winter salad with actually 140 plants. That's a totally separate talk about how I put together 140 plants in the middle of winter with snow on the ground without using freezing or any electricity. I didn't have a greenhouse. So this is all local food produced in my house, and a few foraged under the snow in the garden. I also made a calzone from Sicily. This was a recipe. Actually, you can see it in the back of my book. The whole list of plants in this calzone are included. I found a recipe on the internet for this traditional Mediterranean dish, and it took me 6 years to make this because I first had to grow these 53 plants in order to make it. And that takes me back to the fact that these multi-species dishes, which I became known for, were heavily inspired by the Mediterranean diet. As I'm sure most of you are aware, 30, 40 years ago, scientists discovered that old folk who were eating traditional food, particularly in the mountain villages in Italy and Greece and Spain, had very low levels of cardiovascular disease. And ethnobotanists, that is botanists who specialize in the interaction between people and plants, got money to find out what the hell these people had been eating to make themselves so healthy. And when I started reading these papers 20, 25 years ago, I discovered a thing that actually over 3,000 plant species were traditionally used in Mediterranean countries, just in the Mediterranean, huge number. And they also there are also records of many multi-species dishes, particularly in the springtime. They would make salads, they would make like pizzas and calzones, like this example here. They would make soups, all sorts of different dishes, often with over 50 ingredients. It was like a ritualistic spring cleaning of the body, if you like, that they would make these amazing dishes. So this is really what inspired these dishes. It was the Mediterranean diet. And of course, most people can't do this because they don't have such a, most people can't eat the real Mediterranean diet because they don't have access to such a diversity. And 20 years ago, I made it was the anniversary of this world record. I've been a world record holder for 20 years. And actually on the day, we had a group of psychologists visiting us in the garden. They had asked for a garden tour. It's a group of psychologists that work with plants in treatment and nature. And they've been coming every other year. They have a national or international convention locally. And they turned up in my garden. They had no idea that it was an anniversary. And beforehand, we'd made this pizza with 229 plants, which they were presented with. So I presented it to them and said, please analyze. I haven't heard what the result was yet, but they also call me the crazy salad man. Anyway, while we're on the subject of the Mediterranean diet, there was one plant I noticed you have, and I know it's a hugely invasive plant in Australasia. This is fennel. Maybe you have it in your salad today, I don't know. But I just wanted to mention that reading this ethnobotanical literature of the traditional Mediterranean diet, quite possibly the most commonly used herb in the Mediterranean area was actually fennel. And actually, we don't hear too much about that. Fennel isn't, well, we have the Florence fennel, but normally, at least in the UK and Norway, fennel isn't something that you have to grow it yourself. And I struggle with it up here. Unfortunately, it's a bit tender. Yeah. Anyway, this is where I'm living in Trondheim. You can see the UK. I guess you're familiar with the UK. So we're way up north, just short of the Arctic Circle at 63.4 degrees north. And I live in a small town called Malvik, just 10 miles from the city of Trondheim, which is the third largest city in Norway. And we're right next to the Trondheim Fjord, one of the largest fjords in Norway. This really, the fact that the fjord never freezes in winter really ameliorates the climate here in winter, but cools it down in the summer. So we have a very surprisingly mild climate, but it can still get down to -20 centigrade. But in recent years, it's been very rare to get below -15 here. And this winter, I've been able to dig the garden all winter, which is a bit worrying. So this is my plant, my book, Around the World in 80 Plants, that came out in 2014, which I discovered over the years that in my area, actually the perennials were producing more than the annual crops. And I have a very shady garden as well, which favors these woodland perennial plants. So the book is really about as a journey around the world, looking at my 80 favorite perennial vegetables that come back year after year after year, similar to the herbs that I'm sure you're familiar with. And we'll get into that in a minute. But as I mentioned, I traveled around the world giving lectures after my book came out. But I'd been in Australasia before that because back in the late 80s, early 90s, I actually worked as an ocean wave climatologist, like a meteorologist for the ocean waves. And we had a big wave energy, wave power project in Norway was leading the world on ocean wave energy at the time, which has never really taken off. I know in Australia you have some prototype devices off the southern coasts, but this was the final report, which came out in 1996, which I co-authored. And this project entailed that poor old me had to take journeys from cold Trondheim to the Cook Islands, to Fiji, and on several occasions to give talks on ocean wave energy to representatives of the local electricity boards around from the various Pacific islands. And when I traveled down there, then I often took some holiday, and in addition stopped off in particular in Australia and New Zealand. And I remember early 90s I bought these two books. I bought books about foraging around the world, which was a big inspiration. Bush Tucker, 2 books by Tim Lowe, which I've consulted a lot. I tried to grow many of the plants in these books and mostly failed. I did manage one year to grow yam daisy, which I notice is in your collections at Burnley, Microceris Murnong, if that's how you pronounce it, a tuberous daisy, which was very important Aboriginal or native vegetable in the past. Yeah, I grew that just the one time. I couldn't grow seeds to sustain the harvest. It wasn't hardy, but I did get a little taste at least. And on these journeys, I often stopped off in North America. And I remember in Seattle, one year I came across this amazing book, which became my edible Bible. Cornucopia 2, a source book of edible plants, is a book which contains information about 3,000 of the world's edible plants and around 7,000 varieties and cultivars. And as you can see, I've worn out one book. I bought a second, and the second book today looks like the one that's completely worn out. So I've worn out 2 of these. I had this book with me when I traveled around the world and visited botanical gardens, so that I could very quickly look up plants that I could see. I could see the Latin name, and I could find out more and learn more about how these plants were used in local cuisines around the world. And many of these plants were also locally domesticated. So they were moved from nature to local gardens. So there are thousands of vegetables we never hear of because they're not part of the global food trade of today that we or those that use supermarkets have access to. Okay, so let's get on with the plants. Just a second. For me, the queen of the Edimentals is this plant here, which I think you're familiar with. And most of the plants I'm showing here, or almost all of them, are you either find them at Burnley or in the Melbourne Botanical Gardens. I actually didn't see hosta noted for Burnley, but hosta, and there are 10,000 different cultivars and 25, 30 different species of hosta in Asia, are the most popular ornamental plants around the world. And to discover that hosta also was a fantastic, nutritious vegetable was a real, and I discovered this I found it in this book, Cornucopia 2, when I bought that. But it took me many years to actually try to eat this plant because I hadn't heard of anybody else in Europe who had done this. It was totally missing from all the books about Oriental oriental vegetables that started coming out in the 70s, 80s. So it's totally missed. And but it's a wonderful ornamental as well. Both the leaves, it's grown for the leaves and it's grown for the flowers, and it's highly adaptable to different climates. I've seen it in the heat of Atlanta, Georgia, and I've also seen in Arctic Norway. So it adapts to many different climates. And just briefly, so hosta comes from the Far East, in particular, northern China, Japan, Korea. And it's in this area, in particular, Japan, which is one of what we can call a biodiversity hotspot with almost 2,000 endemic plants, many of which we actually grow as edimentals, ornamentals in Europe, and I'm sure also in Australasia. So there's a huge number of plants in this area, and there are also rich foraging traditions which we can get inspiration from. These plants, which were originally harvested from nature, were called sansai in Japan, or sanamu in Korea. These words literally mean mountain veggies, mountain vegetables, which were harvested in the mountains. And people have moved from the mountain villages into the cities, and they remember the fantastic taste of the wild vegetables. So there's a whole market, particularly in Korea and Japan, that has grown up around the cities to cultivate on farms these previously foraged vegetables. And hosta is one of these. And just a little a fact, it turns out that about 1/3 of all the plant species in the world have been used for food. If you look at the statistics from these ethnobotanical studies. So maybe over 100,000 species have traditionally been used for food. Many are in what I call the emergency food category, if you get my meaning. But there are many really good edible plants, and most of them are actually perennial plants. The first time I wrote about, I think I was the first to write about hosta as a food plant. It's called the Oriental Spinach, Perennial Spinach, in Permaculture magazine in the UK in 2008, and which really started a journey for me. You use the young shoots in the springtime, typically before they fold out is the best time, which you can use just as a spinach or as a salad. And in Japan, they blanch the young shoots by so you could, in a garden, you could just put a bucket over the roots early in the spring, and they would harvest these slightly sweet tasting, no bitterness. I've never detected bitterness in hostas, and you can use any species, but it's mainly, of course, the larger hosta species, Hosta sieboldii in particular, Hosta montana, which are used for food. The flowers and also the flower shoots are good. Now, the guy who owns this place here, I'm sure you're familiar with, he has a national collection of large-leaved hostas in the UK. This is, of course, earlier Prince, now King Charles. His forest garden at Highgrove is, and when I wrote the article in Permaculture magazine, I kind of joked that the Prince Charles had the most productive forest garden in the UK at that time. He didn't know. And then it happened that I was asked to give a talk in the UK to a group called the Walled Garden Network. It's a network of large gardens in the UK that have big walled gardens. And little did I know when I showed this slide that the then Prince Charles's head gardener was sat right in front of me. After the talk, he came up to me and said, "Wow, I had no idea that hosta was edible. That's really interesting. Couldn't you tell me some give me some more information. So I very quickly got out a copy of my book and wrote to HRH Prince Charles, good luck with your hosta cuisine, or something in that matter. That winter, the Prince's private secretary sent me an email, and it ended up with me being invited to Highgrove to see this national collection and talk a bit more about the edibility of hostas. Sadly, the Prince couldn't make it. He had a very bad excuse. His mother had a birthday that day. In Japan, in all the supermarkets, I had a study tour to Japan. I was lucky to be invited to on a study tour with a Japanese horticulturist who translated for us. And all the supermarkets at the end of March, beginning of April, had these blanched hostas, which they literally call hosta icicles translated from the Japanese. Very popular vegetable they always have this sansai or mountain veggies collection in the supermarkets. And these are just some pictures I stole from a Facebook group of a hosta farm in Tokyo that produce these shoots for the markets all over. And they basically dig up, so they grow in big fields, and they dig up the whole plant, including the roots, in the autumn before the frosts come. This is in the mountain areas in Japan. And these big mounds get covered with snow, and they basically pull the roots out into these greenhouses on a regular basis. It takes a couple of weeks, I think, to produce the shoots and send them to the market. And then the next round starts. So there are several rounds of production based on these amazing, who would have known? But in a home garden, you would just cover with something. It could just be straw. It could be. But you don't need to blanch them for the flavor. The flavor is delicious anyway. To the left, hosta copita, based on the Greek spinach pie, spanakopita, just exactly the same recipe, replaced with the hosta shoots. And of course, hosta is often, at least in my climate, is available at a time of year when spinach and other similar plants isn't available. And to the right is just a couple of sushi dishes where the leaves here were used. But you can also use the leaves as kind of wraps, very commonly used in Korea, for example. And this is when I visited a Japanese family in Japan, and they showed me how they used with a dipping sauce. Often it's sufficient with they use sesame oil, roasted sesame seeds, and soy sauce as a dip when they're eating the hosta leaves as a salad. So this is my garden. It's a little over half an acre. It's not the kind, it wouldn't at the outset look like a place where you could have such a big collection of edible plants, but because it is become known as one of the oldest forest gardens in Scandinavia, at least, although I never knew what forest gardening was when I started out. I was interested in nature. I wanted birds and nature around me where I was living. But at the same time, as a young vegetarian who'd moved from the UK to Norway, a place where it seemed, and I joke, it seemed that vegetables were illegal here. There were just so few available. That compared to the UK at that time, that I had to start growing my own. And it kind of evolved over time into this mainly collection of perennials. I'm also involved in a community garden today, which is about halfway into the botanical garden in the city, where I also grow more traditional vegetables. One of my favorite perennial vegetables, and the biggest, which always amazes people when they visit my garden in the middle of June, just 6 weeks after the first shoots appear. This is Japanese asparagus, or udo, Aurelia cordata. Now, I didn't see this particular species listed either at Burnley or in the Melbourne Botanics, but you have another Aurelia which is very closely related, Aurelia californica, which can be used in exactly the same way. There are a number of different species which are used, so this is almost the Arctic. So this really surprises people that growth is so amazing at this time of year, and it partly has to do with the fact we're so far north that we don't see the night sky we don't see the midnight sun quite, but we have bright light skies throughout most of the summer, most of the growing season. Anyway, it's the young shoots which are used of this plant, extremely important sansai vegetable in Japan, as we'll come back to. You can blanch them to get a milder taste and just use them in a salad, as you can see here, again with a dipping sauce. The broccolis, as I call them, unopened flowers, are also delicious. They use them in tempura in the Far East. And as part of this study tour to Japan, I was lucky to be possibly the first European to visit this rather amazing udo farm right in the middle of Western Tokyo. It's an old farm which has been preserved in this area, and they grow udo on out in fields, and then they move the roots down into these underground caverns under the farm, actually under a small forested area in the farm. And it's totally dark down there, and the young shoots grow very quickly and evenly because the temperature is even. They were saying it was about 17, 18 degrees centigrade down there when we visited early in April. Absolutely amazing to see. The farmer said he'd never had any contact with Europeans before, so that was extra special. And this was the highest quality of udo which was available on markets in some commanded the highest prices. And this is me and the farmer, and they also cultivated in overground sheds, where the light was blocked out, but here the temperature fluctuates more and gave a less even quality product. And even I was in the mountain areas as well and saw how they mulched. They used rice husks, which is to polishing the rice, etc. They have all this rice husks available, which they use for mulching the udo on this farm, which was interesting to see. So there's a more traditional way. But they also harvest the green udo from nature, and this is in general used as was served up in a restaurant we visited, in tempura. So vegetables stay in oil, and often you'll find that it's actually slightly stronger tasting vegetables which are best, because the oil kind of coats your tongue so that you don't detect the bitterness as much. And the green udo is slightly unpleasantly bitter if you just use it as a vegetable. That's why they blanch them in general for using as salads. Another one which I think was at the Melbourne Botanics, Aurelia lata, or devil's walking stick, also called angelica tree. Devil's walking stick because it's a young tree rather than udo, which is a herbaceous perennial, and has thorns all up there. And I once, it's growing on a very steep slope in my garden, I once slipped, and the automatic reaction is to reach out your hand to grab onto something. And it was the devil's walking stick that was right next to me. Yeah, I said more than devil, I must say. It's called Taranomi, and again, is in all the supermarkets in Japan, as here, in at least in the springtime when these trees are producing. Very important vegetable. Another one from the Far East. We're now moving over to the carrot family. Angelica, you have this one here, often grown as a ornamental plant, this Korean Angelica or red purple Angelica, which, yeah, as the name says, originates from Korea and the Far East. Very hardy plant, and I was totally bowled away. It's also called Dan Quai and used in medicinal, alongside like Angelica sinensis. And I was bowled away by the fact that the flower shoot, if you harvest the flower shoot just before the flowers open, is actually very sweet tasting. And as it says here, in the young leaves also are often used in Korea, boiled and fried with onions, garlic, sesame seeds, etc., as you can see at the bottom right. Many of the Angelica, when they get to this stage with the flowering stems, they are delicious and lack the bitterness of the young leaves. They're also what I term an edimental, which is another word I came up with to describe these edimentals that were also insect friendly. Ento from entomology. And in particular, the carrot family are really, really popular with pollinating insects. So this is an absolutely prime edimental. What's not to like about plants that are both tasty, they look good, and they're good for nature as well. Another one, which I just put in here because Sam sent me an email earlier this morning and told me that he just harvested Ashitaba. Angelica casei is a small, is a species which originates from a small oceanic island off the coast of Japan, which has become a popular herb, but also in Japan it's used as a vegetable and is cultivated to a certain extent. And we saw it actually in a supermarket, just together with all other vegetables. You can see Welsh onion to the left there, and we also visited a family in the mountains, and they were actually growing Ashitaba on their windowsill as a kind of edible medicinal plant. So they just pick off bits and eat a bit every day as preventative medicine. So Ashitaba is an amazing one, but I struggle. I have to overwinter indoors because it doesn't have much hardiness coming from an oceanic island where frost is almost never happens or never happens. And in Norway, another Angelica, this is our most popular, most used traditional wild plant in Norway, both by the Norwegians, who would harvest the flower stems, which are sweet, as I mentioned, as the candy of the day. So if you go back 100 years or so, people took long walks up into the mountains to find the Angelica, and they were so much used that they were totally harvested by Norwegians in the Norwegian mountains at that time. However, the indigenous people in Norway, the Sami people, this was an extremely important vegetable for them. And of course, they harvested in a sustainable way. So we'll come back. You see, if you harvest the flower stem, then often the plant wouldn't produce seed and it would die. So in that way, you could easily overharvest. But the traditional people, they knew this and harvested in a much better way. And we have one variety called the Voss Angelica. Voss is a mountain village in southwestern Norway, where this variety, which actually has stems which are totally filled, so it has more flesh compared to the wild species, and because there's more flesh and probably the same amount of bitter substances in the plant, it tastes sweeter to us. So it was traditionally grown on farms in the Voss area and have survived in a few locations, which we're now protecting and trying to conserve in our national seed saver organization, which is also called Kwan, the name of the plant. Another umbellifer, which I noticed in your plant list, is Crythmum maritimum, or the rock samphire, which is a plant which grows on the white cliffs of, in particular, of southern England. Here we see it, Shakespeare Cliff in Dover, top left, where many of the green plants growing on the sheer cliff is this rock samphire, growing in a very dangerous place to harvest, but they lowered themselves on ropes to gather this plant. Hence, I call this plant the death samphire, because probably more people have died harvesting this plant than have died eating other poisonous carrot family plants, umbellifers. But it was actually cultivated in home gardens in the 19th century. People would take a load of chalk home to their garden and grow this sea samphire in those conditions, which is quite interesting. And this was the original samphire. Samphire nowadays refers to Salicornia. I know you have a perennial species, Salicornia australis, which I think is also called samphire or some Aboriginal name. And it was traditionally pickled and sold on the streets of London back in the Middle Ages. It was a very important vegetable at that time, which has almost disappeared now. Nobody wants to harvest it in the wild, at least, anymore. And there's another story that Darwin related, that one of his friends actually used a rifle to shoot the samphire down from the cliffs. So again, death samphire. And this is a recipe I found on the internet for a recipe from the Middle Ages. Another great umbellifer, hogweed. Now I don't know whether hogweed has really invaded your part of the world. I think I read that at least the giant hogweed hasn't really established in southern Australia. In Victoria, I think there was one record in Tasmania or something, but you're really aware of this. But when I moved to Norway, people, despite the fact that in the best known book about wild food from the UK in the 80s, Roger Phillips' Wild Food, he writes in this book, "This is unequivocally one of the best vegetables I have eaten. Hogweed shoots will surprise even the most conservative of your friends." So even though it was highly praised in the UK, in Norway, this was poison. You shouldn't go near it. And over the years, researching about the edible plants of the world, I discovered the Heracleum genus, the hogweeds, is probably the most used wild edible across the Northern Hemisphere through the ages, both in Japan. Native Americans in North America would travel for days to the best stands of hogweed to harvest in the springtime and then ferment. I noticed that you do have Heracleum lanatum in your collection, which is a North American species, also known as cow parsnip. That was the species that was used by the Native Americans. particularly on the west coast. But be careful. The reason that it was known as being poisonous was because you could get severe burns from the interaction of sunlight and the plant juices, in particular the giant hogweeds, which we have in Norway. But actually, well, one thing is that, borscht, which is this Russian soup, beetroot soup, actually the word beetroot, the word borscht actually means hogweed shoots originally in Russian, because this was a hogweed soup. It could either be fresh young shoots in the springtime of hogweed or fermented hogweed shoots later on and in the winter. And they're fairly sweet tasting. And then beetroot came along and they could grow it in their home gardens very easily. And eventually borscht morphed into a beetroot soup. But originally this was a hogweed dish. And the best thing of hogweed for me is probably, and these are at the top of my list of Edimentals as well, because the insects are absolutely crazy all summer over a long flowering season for the pollen and nectar produced by the hogweeds. But the best thing for me for the hogweeds are the seeds as a spice. In Iran, it's called golpar, and the actual species which is used in Iran is actually one of the giant hogweeds. So one of these terrible invasive weeds is actually a super important national ingredient in Iran. And you can find the seeds in Iranian supermarkets around the world, marketed as golpar, Golpar. And you can use any species, so you could use lanatum that you have in the garden there. And it's a good thing. You're harvesting the seeds of these invasive species, so you're stopping them spread. I've completely replaced cumin in my kitchen with golpar. In Iran, they often sprinkle potatoes with golpar, but other recipes which call for cumin, like onion bhajis, if you're into Indian food like I am, growing up in the UK, then use golpar rather than cumin, delicious, or in falafels, the two most important vegan foods out there could be growing. I mean, cumin is very difficult for us to grow in Norway because it's a subtropical spice, but golpar is very easy for us to grow. Another one, which was also mentioned on your list, Sam, I think you have on the table in front of you this morning, or this evening, sorry, is Alexander's Smyrnium species, is a tender perennial plant which grows on coastal environments, coastal cliffs in the UK and around the coasts of Western Europe, at least one of the species, and difficult for me to grow. I do manage to grow a little bit right up against the wall of my house, heavily mulched with leaves. So last week I was able to harvest, and it grows very, very quickly. It grows most in the winter. So in the UK, you can start harvesting in January. So that's a bit like August with you, I guess. And again, really popular for the spring emerging insects, pollinating insects. So very important to have in a garden also. And another one which hasn't quite made it to Melbourne yet, I don't think, At least I didn't find it in either of the lists, but it's not a surprise because it's unusual also in botanical gardens in Europe. But I think of it very similar to Alexander's in that it is you can harvest it in the winter, so it's winter hardy. The leaves are green, and as long as the temperature is just around about zero or a little bit above, it will grow quite vigorously. It comes from a very small island called Uluung between Japan and Korea, and it's an endemic to that island, Distania tachysemana. Again, super popular with pollinating insects and a great one for winter vegetables in a cold climate in particular. Asparagus, we all know there are a few perennial vegetables which are available in the supermarkets, but nowadays, actually the word asparagus in the original language from the Middle East actually means spring shoot, no more than that. But nowadays we can buy asparagus in our supermarkets year round, mostly produced in Peru and China from around the world. For me, that kind of defeats the point in many ways. This is a spring vegetable that I look forward to every year and harvest at the right time. To import it from the other side of the world just seems crazy. Anyway, asparagus, I notice you have different species. I don't think any of the other species of asparagus you have been used for food. But obviously a well-known one, as are the artichokes, another perennial plant which you can buy in supermarkets around the world. Bottom right is artichoke intercropped with olives in Italy. A nice combination, I thought. And artichokes, of course, are a fantastic ornamental as well when they're in flower. Cardoons, particularly the cardoon and the artichoke, is actually originally the same species, but they've been selected in two different directions. The one for the broad cardoon for the broad petioles, leaf petioles, and the artichoke for the enlarged flower receptacles. And even asparagus has been grown as an ornamental in ornamental borders due to the feathery-like leaves. So I've seen that at RHS Wisley in the UK. And then on to Aztec potatoes, or more familiar with them as dahlias. A huge number of cultivars of dahlias, but originally they came to Europe as an edible plant, but were outcompeted. The tubers were eaten, but were outcompeted by the potato in the 19th century. They were maybe not so good tasting, not so productive, but nevertheless, if you have a surplus of dahlias available in the autumn, then please have a taste. They're totally safe to eat, and the flowers too are very tasty. Acolquitl in Mexico, and it's last autumn. I've been talking about dahlias for some years as a great edimental, and the guy here is a botanist at the Botanical Garden in Kristiansand in southern Norway, who have a national collection of old varieties of dahlia. And I mentioned to him under this visit that, well, what do they taste like? Wouldn't it be interesting to have a taste test of all the different varieties and get a winner? And that actually happened last autumn. On the left are the three, we had a jury of three that tasted them, and the ones with the best tasting tubers were on the left-hand side. And actually the tastes were not enormously different. Very mild, slightly sweet tasting. Some people say they taste a little bit like asparagus, a little bit like carrots, there are a lot of different taste sensations in there. But dahlia has been selected for the flowers rather than for the tubers. So we need to go, and is work ongoing in the United States, trying to select for larger yields of tubers, good tasting tubers of dahlia. So maybe in the future you will find dahlias in supermarkets as a food plant. And in Mexico, where dahlias come from, in 1963, dahlia was chosen as the national flower. And there's been a renaissance in recent years. Both the flowers and the tubers have been used. Traditionally, it was mainly the tubers which were used, but in recent years, people have started also using the flowers as a kind of decoration in different dishes. So it's like the big restaurants in Europe and Australia have been, it's how the food is presented nowadays, and this has also been a phenomenon in Mexico. Here's two of my over-the-top salads, as I call them. Actually, I hated dahlia flowers before. I thought they were a bit too much, if you see what I mean. So these salads were put together a few years ago, but dahlia is part of the daisy family, Asteraceae, and it's actually this family which has the most edible species in the world. We know of lettuce and artichoke I've just talked about in this family, but there are many, many others. So I've just put together a few pictures of a number of other ones which are used for the young shoots in the springtime. Aster cordifolius, or heartleaf aster, you have in the gardens there at Burnley. It comes from North America and was an important Native American vegetable in the springtime. Asascaba, I didn't see in the list, but just mentioning this because it's one of the top two wild harvested sanamul, as they call it, mountain veggies in Korea, which is beautiful, but for some reason has never become an ornamental, not in Europe and as far as I can see in Australia either. But it's cultivated nowadays on a large scale, cultivated in greenhouses around the big cities. The leaves are sold on markets. They're also dried and sent to Korean markets around the world. There's also Jerusalem artichoke. The young shoots of Jerusalem artichoke are delicious. Ligularia. This is the only species of Ligularia you should eat. Others contain alkaloids in much higher amounts, but this is number one, the king of the sanamul, the king of the foraged vegetables in Korea. Again, grown on a large scale in greenhouses and sold on markets, used both as a spinach, spiced up, very mild tasting leaves, and also used as wraps. These very big leaves are used to wrap around other food. And the last one in this family is interesting, Rudbeckia laccianata, which I saw there were several accessions of at the Melbourne Botanical Garden. I call this Cherokee greens because this was the favorite vegetables of the Cherokee peoples in the Appalachian Mountains in particular. And there's a whole story around this one. And interestingly, the Asians, they love the taste of the aster family, this slightly aromatic taste of the young shoots. And they have adopted this North American perennial vegetable and are now in Korea cultivating this plant on a farm scale in the mountain areas of Korea. Horseradish, you know all about, I'm sure. Maybe you haven't. I also blanch the young shoots of horseradish, which is a thing which has also been used in various European countries in the past to get a slightly milder product. And I force these even in the winter months. So I have some on my window here in my living room, which I have with the young shoots with lunch. Delicious. But for me, it's also an edimental in that during the flowering time, it's absolutely fantastic and covered with pollinating insects. So an edimental too. And the flowers are also delicious. But you might not have seen this because it seems that horseradish is actually shy of flowering in areas of the world which are a bit too warm for it. Here in Norway, we have perfect conditions and it flowers proliferously. So these wasabi tasting flowers are delicious in salads. Campanulaceae, the bellflower family, includes many interesting species which are both edible and ornamental. We have the campanula. I noticed you have Campanula punctata in the garden, Chinese rampion, which has delicious spring leaves, and the flowers are also fantastic in salads. But there are other genera like Codonopsis, often used in herb medicine in the Far East and also used as vegetables. We have Platycodon, or the balloon flower, which is cultivated over several years for really large roots in Japan and Korea and China. And Adenophora also is another genus which you can use young shoots of. And as far as I know, they are all edible. Probably the oldest edimental in the world that we know of, or perhaps the oldest edible plant in the world, are the daylilies. Again, a superstar of the ornamental world, with, again, approaching 10,000 different cultivars. When using daylilies, I like to keep to the more primitive forms, the species such as Hemerocallis fulva and citrina, which are these are the species which are cultivated on a big scale in China in particular. And what do you use? You can use the young shoots in the springtime. You can use the flower buds, which are delicious in stir-fry dishes, the flowers, a few flowers in a salad, really spice it up. The flowers are actually slightly spicy too, and beautify it as well. And in China, they will actually harvest the withered flowers. Daylily has to do with they flower for one day and then they wither and die. So they go around these fields of daylilies and harvest the withered flowers and then dry them and use them as an ingredient in winter soups, a kind of a herb in Chinese. And you can buy these so-called golden needles in Chinese supermarkets, again, around the world. So what's not to like about daylilies when they're so useful? So this is a daylily farm in Taiwan. This could be more or less anywhere around the world because the daylilies are, they're both hardy and warmth tolerant. I see that you have quite a few there in Melbourne. And this is from the Botanical Gardens in Oslo, in Norway, where the gardeners have very kindly planted snacks for the public next to the benches. This one you also added. This one I also added at the last minute, Sam, as I saw it was one of the ones you harvested this afternoon. And the sorrels are really superstars of the edible world, which are again have adapted to many different climates. Here in Norway, they grow above the tree line in the high Arctic, but also, as I understand, will grow in Melbourne and quite warm climates throughout the Mediterranean. It's adapted to many different climates, and there are varieties which are kind of edimental as well. We have the bottom right, the wine sorrel, these beautiful reddish leaves. It's a subspecies of sorrel from Southeast Europe. And we have this bottom left, Blonde de Lyon, which is a light yellow, has these yellowish leaves in the springtime. Liliums, there are many species of lilium, and make sure these are the true lilies. It's not enough that it's called like lily of the valley. You definitely don't want to eat. It'll be once, but there are many species lilies, lilium, which are both cultivated and wild collected in the Far East. And this particular one here, on one of my travels to the South Pacific, I found fresh edible lily bulbs in a supermarket in Singapore. I bought them, took them back to Norway, and 2 years later I had these beautiful flowers which were identified as David's lily, Lilium davidii, and which is cold hardy because they're cultivated or wild collected in colder areas and then distributed to markets in warmer areas. And another very familiar one to you, which I know you have in Melbourne, is the tiger lily, Lilium lancifolium, also very adaptable and also a very important vegetable variety. It's the bulbs which are used, the flower petals can also be used in salads, but they're mainly grown for these for the bulbs, which you can just stir fry like you would onion or anything like that. So stir fry dishes, they're delicious and they're very shade tolerant as well. So they're perfect in a forest garden, a shady forest garden community, providing some carbohydrate. One other I noticed, which I don't usually talk about, but yucca. The flowers of yucca are delicious. This one, filamentosa, you have in the garden there. In English, they're called Adam's needle or Eve's thread. And the flowers are delicious. They also use the flower stems, and also the fruits are sometimes used of the yuccas. And I actually managed to grow this one here in Norway. It was a bit of a struggle, had to mulch every winter to protect from the frost, but I did manage to make this salad here, bottom right, with the two English names, Adam's needle and Eve's thread. I called it my needle and thread salad. Okay, just we're nearing the end now, Sam, and just wanted to show a few pictures of alliums before we round off. As I mentioned, I'm today a visiting onion researcher, if you like, at the Botanical Gardens at Ringve in the middle of Trondheim. And I've been so lucky to have the opportunity to create this fantastic edimental allium garden, edimentaliums, as I call them. And this garden was conceived based on a 10-year project I had collecting old Norwegian cultivated alliums in home gardens across the country. And we collected about 80 of these, and they were planted in this garden together with 100 botanical species from around the world, and altogether over 400 different onions. And it's beautiful throughout the season. Flowering starts at the beginning of May, and still there are different allium species flowering each season, and some are still flowering right up to the first frosts in October. Just a few examples of the alliums in the garden here, which I think are particularly noteworthy in an edimental way. First of all, we have the Persian shallots, which you probably have seen being sold as ornamental onions in garden centres and supermarkets in the autumn. I noticed, I haven't seen this particular species mentioned, but I suspect I see that they're being sold in Australia. as they are around the world. And these ornamental onions, they're perennial, and they produce these large shallots called Persian shallots. And there are clusters of small bulbs which are harvested. And in Iran, this is like a national vegetable which is cultivated on farms and also wild collected in the mountains. And there are different species, and most of these you will find in the garden centre racks as ornamental bulbs. And how are they used? Well, in Iran, they have this national dish, mastomisia, which is a yogurt-based dish where they actually dry the onions. So on the farms, they would dry the onions and then it would be distributed in dried form to Iranian supermarkets around the world. They're being sold here in Trondheim, so I'm sure you also have them in Melbourne as Persian shallots, as they call them. And they basically rehydrate the dried shallots and add them to cut them up and add them to the yogurt with, in some cases, golpar, this spice of giant hogweed that I talked about earlier. And a beautiful plant when it's in full flower, so you can have both. You can harvest them, and you don't harvest all the bulbs, you just leave some there, and you can have a perennial bed of Persian shallots going. And the pollinators love them. They love all the alliums as well, which is another reason that the allium genus is my favorite. And yeah, next one, fistulosum, or the Welsh onion. Actually, the name Welsh has nothing to do with Wales. It's a species from Siberia, and someone in the UK misunderstood when it came from Germany. It's actually an old German word, Wallisch, which means foreign. So it was the foreign onion, literally. And they can be really productive. There are hundreds, thousands of cultivars, particularly in the Far East, where they've developed these warm, hardy varieties. You see them everywhere. It's the most popular allium, unlike allium keppel. The common bulb onion is commonest in Europe. I don't know what the case is in Australia, but the original ones from Siberia are super hardy as well. So you've got this whole spectrum of different varieties available for from different climates. And in this picture here, you could harvest everything you can see in that picture and make an onion soup with it. You don't need to use bulb onions for an onion soup. You can use the leaves instead. That makes for just as good a soup. And as perennials, they're much more robust. They're more climate friendly. They use less energy because they come back year after year. It's the ultimate no-dig gardening. They tend to be more nutritious than the annual crops we're growing, and they need less fertilizer. So what's not to like about perennial vegetables? And just a little bit of Norwegian history here, because we have an interesting use of this Welsh onion over here. They've been traditionally planted on turf roofs in the mountain areas of Norway. And there are these old turf roofs are now protected by law, so it's illegal to harvest them. But in the past, we know there were two reasons for planting these onions on these roofs. First of all, because the roofs could get very dry, and sparks from the chimney, from the wood stove, could set the whole building alight. So these onions are succulent, contain a lot of moisture, which then worked to keep these roofs moist during hot weather in the springtime, when they were still using the stove for cooking and things like that. And the woman on the bottom left, she told me that her grandmother always ordered her husband up onto the roof to harvest the onions to use in scrambled egg in the springtime. So they were definitely used for food in addition to being a fire protector. On the coastal areas of Finnmark in the very high Arctic of Norway, we have another onion, which I noted you have Allium schoenopressum or chives growing in the garden. This is a subspecies growing in the Arctic, which really sets the alpine meadows along the coast of northern Norway alight during the summer, and would give an oniony taste to the reindeer milk that the Sami people were using. Leeks, very common vegetable that we're growing nowadays. Most of the modern day leeks are biennial, so after flowering they tend to die. But there are 20, 30 different old perennial leeks, which are found all the way from the UK, where we have Babington's leek, through Belgium, Urepray, which literally means old onion, to Egypt, where you have Kurat, which was a cultivated perennial leek by the ancient Egyptians, and all the way to Afghanistan. And of course, we also have the elephant garlic, which is in particular popular in North America. I don't know how popular it is in your part of the world. There are a number also of pure ornamental varieties which have been developed of this species, Allium ampulopressum. There's a lovely one which is naturalized in Yorktown in Virginia in the USA. Another one is the garlic chives, which I'm sure you're familiar with and you have at Burnley. Fantastic edimental when it's flowering in the autumn, but super important again in Asiatic cuisines where they use both the flowering shoots. There are varieties that have been developed for specifically the flowering shoots. Flowers are totally edible in addition to the spring shoots, and again, popular with the insects. Yeah, and what's not to like about alliums? There's just this amazing diversity of species and forms that have evolved across mainly the Northern Hemisphere. There are very few in South America and one in Africa, but so it's definitely a Northern Hemisphere thing. And they're all super popular with the pollinating insects. So it's amazing for me to work in this beautiful garden surrounded by pollinators and other and food at the same time. These Edimentals. This is just a summary of various plants that I class as Edimentals, which are super popular. So the campanulas, the onions, poppies, in particular opium poppy, which is very a popular garden plant here in Norway, super. And you can use the seeds on bread, for example. What else have we got here? On the left, we have various thistles, which are in a class of so-called quadruple value plants. So they're both edible, ornamental. They're insect-friendly, pollinator-friendly, in addition to being bird-friendly. So this Edimentals, avian, they produce seed, which is eaten by various finches in the winter, such as the goldfinch, for example. I think you have that in Australia. I know in New Zealand there were huge amounts of it, of that species invading. So these and the artichokes, of course, as well. These are all produce seeds, oil-rich seeds, which birds eat in the winter. So these are the perfect plants for any garden. So thanks all for joining me in this virtual tour of this wonderful garden you have here at Burnley in Melbourne. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Stephen, and for tailoring it so much to Burnley. And I think, yeah, even when they weren't here, it was certainly very informative. We have time for a few questions if you're able to hang. Is that okay?
Sure. Yeah.
Who in the audience has a question? We probably have time for three.
Okay.
Any takers? Yes, Justine. I'll just.
Hi, Stephen. Do you actually enjoy the taste of all the things that you eat in your salads?
That's a very good question. I'm also often asked this, but actually, if you eat one of these multi-species salads, each mouthful is different.
Yeah.
So it's a mix of mild tasting, sour, the sorrels, for example. You've got sweet tasting, you have the bitter tasting like chicories and things like that. So it all, every mouthful is different, and yeah, I love them. And I've never come across anybody that has commented in a negative way when they've tasted these salads. So you could make a salad with chicory, perhaps, all chicory, and people don't like it because it's a bit bitter. But when you mix everything together, it's and I think this is also important with respect to nutrition. If you're eating one thing all the time, you quite likely will get nutritional deficiency. But if you eat a broad range of vegetables, which is what they did in the Mediterranean countries traditionally, then you cover all angles in many ways. Okay?
Any other questions from the crowd?
Do you have a question, Sam?
I think everyone's just taking it in.
So, maybe another one.
Yeah. Yes.
I just wondered, Stephen, right now in your garden, I know you've tried a lot of things, but about how many different varieties would you be growing in your, was it a half acre?
Yeah, it's a half acre, but I don't cultivate all of it. So about 2/3 of that land, I've conserved the original forest. Actually, I have hazel growing there, which is near the northern limit, and hazel means it's good for us and it's good for the birds. So that was a big attraction when we bought this place. At the moment, in recent years, I now have 3 gardens. Across the 3 gardens, I have maybe 2,000 different edible perennials. In my own garden, it's been going down. I've had a kind of an experiment, at least this is what I tell people, is that I've always been interested in the biological diversity aspect. I was interested in birds as a young man, and when COVID came along and I couldn't travel anymore, I realized I had to find something else to do with my time. So I decided to delve into the insect diversity. So I got myself a moth trap and started trying to identify the different insects, pollinating insects in my garden. And to my great surprise, over just the time since COVID, I've registered over 350 species of moth in my garden. Huge diversity. And that is because I've got a big diversity of plants, because each species of moth at the larval stage is dependent on one particular plant, okay, species, or a family of plants. So it was almost automatic. And I have this edible garden at the same time having a huge biodiversity, and none of the perennial vegetables in particular that I'm growing in my garden have any problems from insects, because they're growing in the springtime when there are a few insects about. Up here there is no snail problem in the springtime, and there are no fungal diseases in the springtime. So the perennial vegetables are easy to grow in an organic way. Whereas the annuals, kales were originally perennial, but we've turned them into a plant that we harvest in the autumn with all the diversity of kales and cabbages and cauliflowers, etc. But the perennial kales are fantastic because they produce leaves in the springtime before the insects start attacking. At least that's the case in my climate. It might be different in Melbourne. Does that? Yeah, so I've kind of downscaled in my garden. I've decided that, well, eventually as I get older, I probably won't be able to manage it. A big collection takes a lot of effort. So I've decided rather than trying to maintain the garden, I have a bit of an experiment and see what will happen if I stop managing the garden. Okay, so many of the bigger perennials are surviving well, but some of the smaller things are being outcompeted because I'm not weeding anymore. And that's been really interesting because I felt myself being sucked into this amazing ecosystem that I've created, forest garden, if you like, over the years, so that I'm becoming more and more integrated myself with my garden. And whereas at the other two gardens I manage today, I have the World Garden, which is a collection of perennial vegetables at this community garden just outside the city. There are over 400 different perennial vegetables on display. And I have control of that and the onion garden at the Botanical Garden, which is on public display all the time. But my own garden is I'm kind of winding down, if you see what I mean. But it's really interesting for me to see how things would have evolved without me. Okay.
There's probably got time for anyone online just to check if you had a question as well. Otherwise, we might wrap it up. But Stephen, this has been our best attended event in a long time. So thank you so much for making it possible. Apologies for the teething issues with the tech, but I think we got there at the end. And, yeah, we'll certainly have to see what we can send you away that will grow in your climate. You know, maybe some Tasmanian plants further down south.
Thank you. Yeah.
To see what we can contribute from our end. Unfortunately, our biosecurity makes it a bit hard to get some of those plants that you talked about, but I'm trying to figure out a way to, you know, do it through proper channels here at Burnley, which was originally established as an experimental plant garden. So we're really keen to get it back to its roots in that sense. So yeah, thanks again, and yeah, we'll be in touch. We usually have a tussy-mussy to give our speakers, but we'll have to just virtual. We'll send you a photo of the salad once it's all done up, and give you a species list. So yeah. Good.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks very much. And just like to say hello to my brother, who seems to have infiltrated this meeting. I don't know if he's paid his membership fees, but I see he's joined from the UK, to my great surprise. Hello, Trevor.
Hello, Stephen.
Falling asleep. Okay, there he is.
All right. Now, but thanks again. And
okay, so thanks again.